Hello everyone and welcome to Total Quilter Monthly for May 2021. My name is Mark Garetz and I'm a National Floriani educator, and this month we're going to be talking all about how to get the most out of the grid. Okay, so if you haven't done it already, go ahead and open up either My Decorative Quilter or Total Quilter. And I have my grid displayed here on the screen. You can see it here, all the dashed light gray lines and the heavy purple lines. That's your grid. And if you don't see your grid, the way you turn the grid on and off, or the main way anyway, is over here on the left-hand toolbar, and there's a grid icon right here. And if you click the grid icon, it turns it off. And if you click the grid icon again, it turns it back on. Now that's one of several different ways to see the grid. The other is to come up to the ruler bar here on the top, or you could use the one here on the left, but I always use the one here up on the top. If you right click on that ruler bar, there's also a little menu selection here that says Show Grid. If you click that, it does the same thing. If I right click on the ruler bar and click Show Grid again, it will go ahead and show the grid. So that's a couple different ways to do it. The other way you can do it is to come up here to the View menu item, and there's also a grid menu selection here. So if you click that, it'll turn the grid off. If I go back to View and click Grid again, it'll turn the grid back on. So that's the three different ways you can get the grid to turn on and off. And if you want to adjust the grid, here's how you do it. You right click on this menu, on this ruler bar up here. So right click and come down here to where it says Grid Settings and click that, and you will get your options here for selecting the various grid settings. So let's go over what those are. Here is your spacing setting. It's got a horizontal spacing and a vertical spacing, and right now I have it set to 0.25, and you can see right here it says inches, and that's because my ruler bar is set up to be in inches. If I were to change this to metric, I would see all of these dimensions in metric. But right now I'm in inches, and I've got it set to 0.25, which means 1/4 of an inch. So that means my vertical grid and my horizontal grid spacing is 1/4 of an inch, and so that makes squares because it's even. They don't have to be squares. You could make it rectangular or whatever you want. And this is where you select the color of the grid. This light gray color is the default. I happen to like that, so I don't change it. But if you want to change it, you can click this little down arrow and you can select any of these common colors. You can click More here to get a more detailed color palette that has more colors to select with a single selection. You can select Custom and select any color you want by clicking anywhere in this grid area here of the spectrum. You can do it numerically here. You can adjust the brightness by this slider here. You can also select a color from the design by clicking this eyedropper and then coming over to any place you can see on the screen and clicking, and it'll make it that color. Now, usually you don't have to do this because light gray is probably the best color choice for this, but if you don't like light gray, you can change it. So I'm going to click Cancel here. And so that's your grid spacing for horizontal and vertical. You also have another grid spacing called Grid Major, and that is these purple lines out here, these purple lines, and you can see the color right here. And this is a multiple of this minor grid spacing over here. So what this says, I've got it set to 8, so that means every 8/4 of an inch make a heavier line. And so if you take 8 times 0.25, that's 2, so it means every 2 inches on my grid, I'll get a heavy purple line. Just like this setting here, I can change the color to anything I want. I'm not going to go through that again because you get that. So this lets me change it. So I like this particular grid setting, especially for quilting, but you can change it to anything that you like. All right, and so you can see here these major grid lines. They're there mainly for reference. Okay, now you can also change the appearance of the minor grid lines. Okay, so that's done in the style box right here. So you can select the grid as dashed lines, which is the default, which is I have. You can select show as solid lines. So if I do that and click OK, you'll see it as solid lines. This looks more like a traditional grid. And if you like that look, you can use that one. Once again, I'm going to right click here and go back to my grid settings. And you can show the grid as dots. And if I say OK, that shows the grid as dots. Now, one of the artifacts of that is when you have dots, it takes away your major grid lines. So you're going to have to use the ruler here as a reference only. So I'm going to go back to my grid settings and turn it back to the way I like it, which is dashed lines, which is the default, and click OK. And now we are back to my default. All right, so this is very useful if you work with multiples of 2 for quilt blocks, like 6x6, 8x8, 4x4. Having a 2-inch major grid line is very useful. If you work in odd numbers like 5x5, then maybe having it every 1 inch might be more useful. So that's totally up to you. And these grids you can see right now are aligned to the ruler. All right, so my ruler's in inches and my grid is also in inches, so you can see that it aligns. Now the grid starts at 0, 0 in the center. So here's 0, and here's the center, and here's 0. So that's where we are right here in the center. And if you change the ruler, though, to metric, and you do that by right-clicking up here and selecting metric, you can see that my ruler changes into metric, but my grid doesn't change. My grid is staying in inches. If I want my grid to be metric, then I have to go in and change my measurements, okay? So if I go right-click here and go back to grid settings, you can see that I'm at 6.35, which is still 1/4 of an inch. It's just showing me in millimeters. If I wanted it to line up with my grid, I might select, say, 10 millimeters for the vertical and horizontal. So I'm going to do that and click OK. And now you can see that my grid lines up with the ruler. All right, so let's go back. I'm going to go back to inches here, and I'll go back to my grid settings and go back to 0.25 and 0.25 and click OK. So those are your basic grid settings. There's kind of a different grid that you can use, especially if you're doing cutting on a cutter like a Silhouette, Cameo, Cricut, Brother Scan and Cut, something like that. And that is the mat display. And so that's right here underneath the grid icon, the cutting mat. So if I click the cutting mat icon, I see an overlay of a cutting mat here. And I can, over here in my properties, adjust the page size of the cutting mat. I can select a rotation for it. I can show the cut border, which is this little red inset line here or not. And I can also select from some presets. So this is the 12x12 Cameo. The only other one that's in here is a Cameo 12x24, but I can also change it to custom if I want to change it to something else. Okay, and if I choose custom, it'll allow me to fill in these boxes here to select a custom mat size if I want to use something custom. Now it's in inches right now because I'm in inches in the ruler. If I change this to metric, then these dimensions will also be in metric. Okay, so that shows you a cutting mat, and this is kind of reference for placement. Right, so that's kind of related to the grid, but not really part of the grid. If I have my grid off, I don't see the grid on the cutting mat either. Okay, so I turn the grid on, and I'm going to turn off my cutting mat display. All right, so those are your basic grid settings. Now let's look at some of the more advanced grid settings. If I come up here to the ruler bar and I right-click and I select grid settings, you can see here in my options, I have got 4 different options. I've got snap to grid, snap to guidelines, snap to anchors, and snap to move. Okay, so let's examine what these do. If I turn on Snap to Grid and click OK, what that means is if I draw something now, it's going to snap to the nearest intersection of a grid horizontal and a grid vertical line. All right, so let me zoom in a little bit here so we can see this a little bit better. Let's zoom in 200%. So now you can see that my grid's a lot bigger. If I get a drawing tool, like I'm just going to get this artwork line tool here, if I click in this close to the intersection of two lines and I click, it's going to put the point that I clicked right at the closest intersection. So this is great for drawing squares and straight lines because I don't have to be super precise. So if I want to draw a straight line over to here, I can click anywhere near there and it's going to draw a straight line. If I want to draw a straight line down to here, it's going to draw a straight line down to here and then again back up to here. And if I right click, that locks in that shape that I just drew. So that gives me a lot of precision when drawing shapes. Now, if I have that turned off, okay, and I want to do the same thing, I have to be really precise because it's going to put the point wherever I draw it. So you can see here I'm not being really precise and it didn't make a nice triangle. All right, so I'm going to undo drawing that triangle because it was ugly. But that's what Snap to Grid does. Now, if you're trying to freehand draw or pencil draw or something, and you find that the points are not going where you expect them to go, they're kind of moving, then what you want to do is right click and check to make sure that Snap to Grid is not turned on. Okay? Snap to Guidelines. Guidelines are extra things that you can bring down, and I'll show you how to do that. All right, so to get a guideline, what you do is, I'm going to click off of this here so that, and I'm going to get out of point mode, okay? You right click, or excuse me, you don't right click, you just click on either the horizontal ruler or the vertical ruler, click and drag from that, it will create a grid line. So if I point to this ruler bar, the horizontal top ruler bar here, I click and I drag, you can see it's bringing down this dotted line, and this is a grid line. And if I can set this anywhere I want, and when I let off the mouse, it'll create that grid line. Okay, if I do the same thing horizontally, or vertically rather, I can create a different grid line. Okay, so these are independent of my background grid, this is useful for lining things up like the baseline of text or things or any other items that you want to line up specifically. And if I want to draw something or align something and I want to get to this point right here, Snap to Grid won't let me get to here. But if I turn on Snap to Guidelines and I turn on my pen tool, or my pencil tool rather, and I click right here, you can see that it'll snap to there. All right, but if I go here, it's going to let me put it wherever I want. But when I get close to an intersection here and I click, it's going to snap to that guideline intersection. So that's what Snap to Guidelines do. The other two Snap features, they don't really relate to the grid, so we'll cover those in a different video. So those are your basic grid settings. One of the things I want to show you though is what happens when you use a backdrop and the grid. So your backdrop icon is right here. It's the backdrop tool. If I click it and I click backdrop, it's going to allow me to pick any backdrop from my backdrop library, which is where it defaults to, or I can go to any place on my computer using these icons over here to get a backdrop to trace over. So in quilting, what I usually do is bring in a picture of a quilt block, so I want to trace over to create that block. Today, let's go ahead and load, I don't know, let's load this butterfly here and click open. And there's my backdrop of the butterfly. Now, right now you can see that the grid line is on top of the backdrop. And that's really a pretty useful mode, to have the grid be on top of the backdrop. But sometimes you want it to be the other way around. So how do you change it so that the backdrop is on top of the grid? The way you do that is you come up here to your settings icon, which is this grid, the program preferences, or you can get to it here from the shortcut menu. And if you come here to the view section, you will see a checkbox that says show backdrop below grid. All right, so that means that the backdrop is going to be below the grid, which if the opposite of that is the grid is on top of the backdrop. So, which is what you see here. If I uncheck that and click OK, you'll see now that my backdrop is on top of the grid, so I am not bothered by the grid lines on top. Now in quilting, I usually want to see my backdrop on top of the quilt block, I want to see my grid on top of the backdrop on the quilt block, so I usually have it the other way around. So I'm going to go back and change that again to the opposite setting and click OK, and now I see my grid on top of the quilt block. Or the backdrop in this case. It's a butterfly, not a quilt block. So that is your basic grid settings. There is one other way to get to your grid settings other than right-clicking on a ruler bar, and that is to come to your program preferences and select the grid tab. And this is exactly the same box as you get when you right-click on the ruler bar. I usually use the shortcut of right-clicking on the ruler bar and not coming to this. But either way you want to do it is fine. It's exactly the same settings. So that wraps it up for May 2021. I want to thank everybody for watching and invite you to come back next month for another installment of Total Quilter Monthly.